The Marvel Cinematic Universe, or MCU, has just hit 10 years old. In that time, there's been 18 films, all of varying degrees of quality, and people have ranked them in tons of different ways. Now that the 19th and biggest film, Avengers Infinity War, has been released, it's time to look back on the films of the MCU and see where they stand, before ranking this cinematic juggernaut against its peers. The MCU has been split into 3 distinct phases so far. Phase 1 starting with Iron Man and culminating in the Avengers, Phase 2 being Iron Man 3 to AntMan, and Phase 3 being Captain America Civil War, all the way up to the currently untitled Avengers 4. These phases were largely marked to define the year a main Avengers movie was released. I think one way to look at these phases of the MCU would be to look at how certain directors have had a large creative influence and helped to set the tone for the series going forward. I'd mark the directing phases of the MCU as follows. Phase 1, Jon Favreau, Phase 2, Joss Whedon, and Phase 3, the Russo brothers. Even though these directors didn't of course direct every film from each respective era, I think they've had an unequivocal influence on the films that were made around them, and in some cases they did help here and there in more tangible ways. For example, Joss Whedon contributed scenes between Thor and Loki for The Dark World. Jon Favreau helped to kick it all off, and the MCU really was carried by the style of the Favreau Iron Man until Joss Whedon brought things a step further into comic book territory with the Avengers. The Russo bros ushered in a grittier angle that was still in line with the massive scale action adventure Whedon had delivered. In many ways, the Russos have combined the best parts of both preceding eras. Along with James Gunn's very unique Guardians series, fitting in nicely but unique enough to stand apart from the main thread, we really have been living in the golden age of not only the MCU, but the superhero genre in general. When all is said and done with the final part of this saga in Avengers 4, it really will be a cinematic achievement. Many have tried and failed to build cinematic universes, but none have done it as well as Marvel. None have had the scale, the action, but more importantly the character work to pull it off. Even though there's more movies planned for 2019 and beyond, this era of the MCU is very nearly drawing to a close. Characters will finally end their stories, and that is going to be a joy to see for comic book fans everywhere. So before I explain how I see all these movies, here's full clarity on where I would rank them all pre-Infinity War. The hardest part about ranking these movies for me are the mid-tier ones. A few of them can kind of shift and meander, whereas the top 5 are pretty much set in stone for me. The only time they've shifted has been simply when a better movie has come out. Finally, I'm sure it goes without saying, but this is all my opinion. If you disagree, that's fine, and I'd love to know your rankings in the comments. So without further ado, here's my rankings. 18. Thor: The Dark World. Thor: The Dark World is one of the few MCU movies that I struggle to re-watch. Sure, I enjoyed it upon release, but it's definitely the shallowest Marvel movie. None of it stands out, from the action to the characters, but it's surely inoffensive enough to be worth a watch in the first place, especially if you're a fan of the character. But when you see things like Ragnarok later down the line, movies like this just feel like a waste. We've been robbed an opportunity to get another truly great Thor film because things like The Dark World were rushed out the gate. It's a shame, and in my opinion, it's undeniably the worst of the bunch. 17. Iron Man 2. I forgive it for some of its problems, partly because it comes so early in the universe. Marvel still didn't know in 2010 whether or not this cinematic universe would even work, much less something like the Avengers being pulled off. So having this abundance of setup and callbacks makes sense from a storytelling point of view. I think Kevin Feige and the folks at Marvel learned from this, and we never got anything quite as heavy-handed afterwards. For all its problems, there's a decent finale, Downey Jr. is as charismatic and enjoyable as ever, and it does have some fun moments. It just doesn't hold up in the way the first Iron Man does, in any way, shape or form. 16. AntMan. AntMan is probably the biggest tragedy of the MCU. When Edgar Wright was attached, this felt like it was going to be a proper shake-up, for not only this series but the genre itself. Wright is a master of storytelling, not to mention incredibly adept at fast-paced, high-octane comedy, so it was a huge letdown when he was booted off the project. What we ended up getting is fine, but that's about it. Paul Rudd continues to be one of the most charismatic men of all time, and characters like Michael Penner's Lewis help make the movie a tad less forgettable. But overall, I think this is a bit of a blip within the larger franchise at play. Ant-Man is a great character, and was a blast to watch in Civil War, so here's hoping he'll have a bit more to do in his solo sequel, as well as Avengers 4. 15. The Incredible Hulk. This movie feels like the bastard child of the MCU. Until General Ross's appearance 8 years later in Civil War, it felt largely unconnected from all the other movies. It's a real shame we never got to see Edward Norton's Banner interact with the other Avengers, but Ruffalo ended up nailing the role anyhow. I actually think this movie has some of the better villains in the MCU. Tim Roth's Abomination is hungry for battle, and General Ross is a calculating and nasty presence. Whilst the CGI doesn't really hold up, the spectacle in this movie is still pretty entertaining, although I don't know why they decided to make the Hulk skip all his carbs. It looks a little odd. 14. Doctor Strange. This is where it's going to get a bit more off kilter for some people. I really wanted to like Doctor Strange, I think he's a cool character, and his power set is truly unique, especially within the confines of the MCU. But I just found his solo outing a little bit flat. It's got all the same issues a mid-tier Marvel movie has, the classic Marvel villain problem, an underdeveloped love story, all that not so good stuff. I think what really disappointed me was the lead and the direction they took with the character. Cumberbatch is a fine actor, but he plays it very safe. This is literally Sherlock with spells, and there's no surprises. Before the movie came out, I read Doctor Strange The Oath, and that is a phenomenal comic. I would highly recommend checking it out if you haven't yet. Strange's characterisation in that is perfect. He's arrogant, but more akin to a grumpy old man than, say, Tony Stark. Plus, the dynamic with Wong channels the best buddy cop movies. Wong isn't a sorcerer, he's a master martial artist. Conversely, Strange isn't much of a hand-to-hand combatant at all. They complement each other nicely. In the movies, they're just kind of the same person skill set-wise. It's the same problem I have between War Machine and Iron Man. What's interesting about having a carbon copy of your lead in a superhero movie? The emotional beats didn't work for me, the visuals were cool but not enough to keep me engaged with it. The pacing is really weird too. The first half is relatively slow and methodical. It takes place over a few months, and you get the sense that Strange has been training for a little while. And then the second half is breakneck, loaded with action, and it feels like all the key beats are rushed and robbed of any impact. This is probably the most disappointing Marvel movie for me. I like it, but it doesn't do enough to break the top 10 by a long shot. 13. Avengers Age of Ultron. A lot of people seem to properly hate this movie, and yes, it has problems, but I do think some of it's a little overblown. For everything that kind of sucks about it, there's something really good in there. Quicksilver sucks, but Hawkeye is awesome. There's that whole weird cave B-plot with Thor, but then there's the scenes on the farm. There's the Hulkbuster sequence, but then there's the Cap-Ultron fight. There's that nonsensical finale, but then there's that awesome scene where the Avengers have all those flashback visions. I don't think Whedon is as good as the Russos at letting characters get their moments. He seems to constantly like to have characters point out that they're no match for others. Iron Man just wrecks dudes constantly. He destroys Ultron with ease, and then literally 10 minutes later he knocks out the Hulk. I mean, come on. I also really detest hero v hero fights like this. There's no emotional stakes behind this fight. They're just fighting because mind control is a thing. There's no consequence to their relationship if one of them beats the others up. Literally, the only pleasure an audience can get from a scene like this is speculating, ooh, I wonder who would win in a fight, this jackass or this dickhead, and oftentimes they end in a stalemate anyway. Ultron just sucks. I don't agree with the decision to model him on Stark at all. There's already way too much snarky dialogue going on in these films anyway. Why couldn't Ultron have been more like Skynet? Emotionless, calculating, like a true machine. And he ends up accomplishing nothing, at least in this film. More on that in a bit. 12. Captain America, the First Avenger. I think a lot of people will tell me I put Doctor Strange too low, and at the same time I'm expecting some people to tell me I've put this a little too high. But this movie is what introduced me to, and subsequently made me fall in love with, the character of Captain America. Chris Evans nails this character. Even when he's souped up and more muscle than man, Evans still plays it as though he is a 90-pound nerd. That shines through, and is a big reason why I think the character is so likeable and accessible. He really helps to make this movie so watchable, because the rest of it is average to more than a little hokey. I do appreciate the style they were going for. It's a neat little Indiana Jones inspired romp for a cosmic cube. It's got plenty of Nazi/Hydra punching, and it's nice to see what the MCU looked like during World War II. I think this probably has some of the poorer action scenes in the series, particularly when you see where Cap ends up. I think it's funny how Cap starts out weak as shit and ends up making Stark his bitch, whilst Thor begins his cinematic run amped to the tits, and for a long while he could barely do anything powerful at all. I'm glad they fixed that, eventually. 11. Black Panther. Black Panther is pretty overrated. That's not to say there's not a lot to like, because there is, but it doesn't even break the top 10 for me. It's got some pretty obvious structural problems. Aside from the gladiatorial combat scenes, the action is pretty lacking, not to mention too often reliant on CGI. Killmonger is a good villain, but as I've outlined in a previous video, he comes into play a little too late for my liking. It's cool to see a predominantly black cast in a movie, and Black Panther has a bevy of lore and characters to mine. I just didn't feel like they stuck the landing on his first outing. I'm a big fan of Ryan Coogler's previous directorial efforts, but I think this stands as his weakest movie. That being said, I'm excited to see where he takes the inevitable sequel. 10. Iron Man 3. I remember being shocked, and more than a little angry at Iron Man 3 when it came out. It felt like a heaping of bad decisions after the other, and coming off the back of Avengers the previous year, it wasn't anything like what I was expecting. But years on, I'm thankful to say I was completely wrong about this movie. I'm a complete apologist for that Mandarin twist. It's smart, fun, and gives the MCU one of the few earth-shattering surprises, right up there with their Hydra reveal in Winter Soldier. No one cares about the comic Mandarin anyway, even if they like to tell you they do, so who cares? I think the only issue with this twist is that the villain behind the mask ends up being a little generic in Aldrich Killian, but that's not really a problem with the twist in concept, and I'm glad Marvel were bold enough to take the risk. If you're a fan of Shane Black movies, then it's best to go into this expecting Kiss Kiss Bang Bang 2 rather than an Avengers movie, which is fine by me. 9. Thor Ragnarok. Thor Ragnarok is great, and I've noticed for a lot of people it takes the top spot, so maybe this is a little bit low in my list for some. It's a hell of a ride, and I love just how much stuff happens to Thor. He loses his dad, his hammer, his homeworld, his best friends. All of that is great, not to mention we get things like Jeff Goldblum being full tilt Jeff Goldblum. I think sometimes it leans a little too far into the comedy. All of the jokes land and it's a really funny movie, but sometimes they really undercut the drama. Why is Korg making fun of Asgard's destruction right in front of Thor? Does this guy have no empathy? I mean, more so, did he not just see how much Thor kicked the shit out of Hela's minions? Korg is going to get fucked up if he doesn't shut the hell up. The new additions to the cast are great. Hela was good, but not great. Watching it gives me the impression that Taika Waititi really wanted to make the Planet Hulk stuff, but wasn't so moved by the Ragnarok stuff. Which is fine, but maybe the movie would have been better served by picking a side rather than trying to fulfill plot holes. On that note, did anyone else notice how similar it's structured to The Dark Knight Rises? Hero gets ass kicked, gets banished and imprisoned in another place, as his home gets subjugated by the villain. Hero makes it back just in time for tea, with a rejuvenated skill set, and finally lays the Rocky 3 smackdown to their foe. Both movies are great, by the way. 8. SpiderMan Homecoming. SpiderMan Homecoming isn't a particularly standout action movie, but it's a great teen comedy. Tom Holland finally brings us the high school Spider-Man the Amazing series could only fail to promise. He's funny as Spider-Man, headstrong and smart, but also a complete dork in the most Peter Parker-y way possible. This movie probably has one of the strongest supporting casts of the series, everyone from Ned to the decathlon teacher to Hannibal Buress not giving a shit about Jim, they're all great. Iron Man gets a little more to do than I had been expecting, and he works really well as a mentor figure to Peter, especially in the wake of Civil War. This is how you pass the torch to a new character as one closes in on their swan song, without simply recasting the character or passing the mantle. The Vulture breaks the villain curse a full year before Killmonger. He's terrifying but also very human. I like that he respects Peter for not only saving his daughter's life, but subsequently his own. And on that note, the father-daughter twist in this movie is excellent. I love seeing Michael Keaton go full dad in this movie, it is hilarious. 7. Thor. The first Thor movie probably still to date had the hardest job in terms of cohesively fitting in with the rest of the canon. Even films like Guardians were coming off the back of multiple alien invasions at that point. Thor was the first to introduce a whole host of concepts to the MCU, including magic, space travel, alien worlds, gods, and even Australians. As a neat little fish out of water comedy, it really works, and Thor is a compelling addition to the MCU. But as we all know, it's Loki that steals the show. He goes from being a belittled younger brother to having the rug pulled out from under him, to embracing his heritage and genuinely trying to impress his would-be father. His arc is neat, and you do really feel for him. Plus, it's a perfect segue into the first Avengers film, and I totally buy where he ends up in that movie. Up until Ragnarok, this is also the best depiction of Thor's powers on screen. In between these films, he's a little bit nerfed. Going back and watching him lay the smack down to an army of frost giants is always a refreshing joy. Iron Man. Iron Man might be the film that started it all, but for me it remains one of their best efforts. It's pitch perfect in pacing, it's got an absolutely tremendous lead in Downey Jr., and there's a great sense of adventure throughout. There's plenty to nitpick. The emergence of Obadiah Stane as the villain is super rushed and last minute, Terrence Howard is completely wasted, but this one really has it where it counts. Not an awful lot to say on this one, other than 10 years on it's still very good. 5. Avengers Assemble. The Avengers is the most rewatchable film in the entire MCU. I don't care where I am, what I'm doing, or how recently I've seen it, I would happily stick this one on any day of the week. It's a hell of a lot of fun to see these characters come together. It satisfies plot threads from 4 different franchises, yet also manages to feel distinctly unique and like a first outing in its own right. Loki gets the most to do in any of his appearances, and Tom Hiddleston chews the scenery just enough to be menacing and incredibly entertaining. The leads all feel like they carve out a genuine rapport with the other heroes. We understand why they might become such good friends and frenemies alike, plus that New York battle at the end is a masterstroke in action film structure. More on that here. 4. Guardians of the Galaxy. Right up until release, I really wasn't hyped for Guardians of the Galaxy. Some of the gags in the trailer weren't landing for me at all, and I was dubious as to how characters like Rocket Raccoon would work in a movie universe that had released The Winter Soldier 3 months earlier. So I was beyond pleasantly surprised to get an emotionally intelligent, yet wacky as hell blockbuster in Guardians Volume 1. Usually in movies we get told that characters are losers, but they're not really by any stretch of the imagination that. The characters in Guardians really are losers. They say stupid things, they make bad decisions, they alienate people around them, and they're stuck in their dead-end lives. Chris Pratt's Star-Lord feels like a guy that wants to be Han Solo, but isn't nearly as calm and collected, which is awesome. Drax is fucking hilarious. Groot is endearing, Gamora is actually competent and intelligent, unlike the others, and Rocket just works, which is incredible. Guardians of the Galaxy is probably one of the best jumping on points for the MCU. It's succinct and fun and doesn't ask its audience to have watched anything else before it. 3. Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. It would be impossible to talk about this movie without talking about the preceding part. I'm sure it might be somewhat surprising for me to actually prefer this movie to the first volume, and I can understand why someone might indeed think the opposite. It's definitely a sloppier movie, it takes a bit longer to get into the meat of the story, and it's got less crowd-pleasing moments. But the emotional highs this movie reaches are some of the biggest and boldest of the MCU. On a personal note, I haven't grown up knowing my father, and this movie really captured all the thoughts and feelings I've had growing up in a very authentic way, which I really appreciate. This did everything I would have wanted from a sequel to a great movie. Rather than giving me the same thing again, it gave me what I didn't know I wanted. 2. Captain America Civil War. Captain America Civil War feels like the true sequel to the first Avengers movie. Much like that first movie, Civil War feels like a real step up for the MCU in terms of scope and scale. So much so that you'll be surprised how well it all works. Within its 2.5-hour running time, it's packed to the brim with a lot of plotting and character, yet focuses up on the right ones at the right points in the story to keep focused. I'm not a huge fan of the Civil War comic book, so I was pleased to see this take some liberties with the source material. In the movie, both sides feel like they have a genuine reason to pick their respective sides, something I never felt was apparent in the comic. It's also nice how this continues the Bucky arc in a satisfying way, tying together numerous threads from not only the Cap movies, but also movies like Age of Ultron. On that note, this movie makes Age of Ultron better, by giving the Sokovia incident, and therefore Ultron himself, the impact that was lacking in that narrative. On top of all this, the airport scene is wonderful, and the final fight between Bucky, Cap and Iron Man is one of the most emotionally powerful we've seen yet. 1. Captain America: The Winter Soldier. Captain America the Winter Soldier has been undefeated as the best MCU movie since its release in 2014. From top to bottom, this movie is just great. It amped up Cap in the wake of the Avengers to make him a truly formidable threat. The action is fiercer than ever before, and the set pieces are some of the most readily memorable across the last few years. We get a great car chase with Nick Fury, probably his best scene in the entire franchise. We get Cap taking on dozens of guards in an elevator, and of course, that freeway scene, which is pure perfection. The Winter Soldier channels the T-1000 in all the best ways, and the decision to reveal that Hydra had been part of S.H.I.E.L.D. the entire time is the best twist in the MCU. Black Widow and the Falcon push Cap in brilliant ways and make the film's overlying theme of friendship emotionally resonant before we see Bucky torn in two at the movie's conclusion. In terms of suspense-filled action drama, this is not only a great superhero movie, but just a really great action movie in its own right. Now, where would I put Avengers Infinity War? As of right now, with 2 viewings under my belt, I'm putting it joint first with the Winter Soldier. Now, I don't traditionally like to do joint places on lists, but my thinking is, yes, it's very, very good. And if it's not the best MCU movie, it's certainly the second best. But I think whether or not it truly owns that top spot will depend on its longevity, its rewatchability, and a host of other factors. But for now, Infinity War is a triumph. Infinity War works for very much the same reasons Civil War did. Sure, it's packed to the brim with characters, but once again, only a few of those characters really drive the story in a meaningful way. Thanos is one of those characters, and he is brilliant. Equal parts intimidating and vulnerable in a way a fully CGI creation never has quite been before. Sure, you know he's not really there, but the technology to bring such a character to life can more than suitably convey enough emotions to make us care, and that's what's important. Everything I said about the emotional intelligence of Guardians Volume 2, this movie surpasses that. The crowd-pleasing moments of the first Avengers film, this movie doubles down on that and then some. If you're not a fan of this genre, then this isn't going to be the one that convinces you. But if you, like me, love these movies, then this is as good as it gets. Until maybe next year. I fully believe in the Russo brothers to deliver a satisfying finale in Avengers 4, and I can't wait. If you'd like to see more from Full Fat Videos, why not check out our channel, or like our Facebook and Instagram pages for all the latest updates. Until next week, stay milky.